Study of Islamic Thought in Africa at Northwestern. I'm the Associate Director and very pleased to be co-sponsoring this conference with Harvard Divinity School. And thank you again to Professor Khan and his team for their hard work. So we're going to start with Professor Amidu Sanni.
Thank you.
His title is Globalization and Glocalization, New Epistemology and Source on African History and Scholarship.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me say that this presentation is part of a larger project, and within the time available to me, I will try as much as possible to zero in on the actual subject of globalization and glocalization and globalization to fall in line with the theme of this particular conference. Well, this larger project I'm working on for quite some time now has to do with rereading African history and African scholarship, making use of indigenous or locally authored materials, specifically the manuscripts by Africans, African authors, African writers, and that was inspired by a number of observations that one was able to make. For example, I came across a piece called Wakad Nasara, which is an Hausa something. It gives a detailed account of the coming of Europeans to Africa, particularly to Nigeria. And some of the information contained there are not to be, the piece of information are not to be found in any Western record, in any other source. So this inspired me that, okay, there's need for us to get a new idea of African history itself using our own, what I would call raw materials, manuscripts, especially those in Ajami, of course, the local, African local languages that are written in Arabic character. So that was the basis of my investigation. And again, it's quite intriguing as well to note that a lot of misreadings and stereotypes still continue about Africa itself, from what I would call the prehistoric time even up to now. And an aspect of that was that people still refer to Africa as a country. And I was surprised to see that in this 21st century, Sarah Palin, I don't know whether you still remember her, the former governor of Oklahoma, was still talking about Africa as a country. Former President Bush was talking as Africa is a country that is affected by a lot of diseases and several other things like that. And I said, look, it is time for us to correct these stereotypes and put the record straight. And I think it behoves we, the academicians, and also, of course, the journalists, to actually put the record straight. So this is part of what I'm... Then again, I just mentioned that there is this new awareness about the works by Africans in the diaspora, particularly through the slave trade period of 16th century up to 19th century. And there have been quite a lot, and that was why I was highly interested to see the presentation by our friend about the Brazilian something today. And I'm trying to use the local materials of even authors from Brazil who have some roots in Nigeria. And at the moment, there is a foundation in Nigeria by one of the Brazilian families, of course, by name Salvador. He adopted the name Salvador. And he just built a mosque called, in the replica of a Kaaba, which he opened some few weeks ago, or some few months ago to be precise. So I'm trying to see the relationship between the Africans in the diaspora, who are also writers on Islam, either in the local language or in Arabic, whatever, and their connection to their roots, so to say. So that's part. So when, and again, I've also come across some of the writing by, for example, Umar Said. We all know him as the first to write an autobiography here. And some of his other 14 works have actually been discovered. And there's also an interest now, even in the Arab world, to study Umar Said and, of course, other African authors, either in the diaspora or even in the Arab world. And so it could be quite interesting to know that the kind of ideology of contempt that had been the characteristic of African authors, even against Africans themselves, I remember coming across the report. Ibn Battuta, we know, is an African anyway, from North Africa. And when he traveled to East Africa and to West Africa and came across some manuscripts that were written in Ajami, that is the local languages. But he didn't consider those ones to be relevant enough to be considered as literature at all, so he just abandoned them. And so now that there's new awareness, even in the Arab world now, there's a new series called Africana series. The first volume by Hilmi Sha'rawi, it's an Egyptian. He's been involved in African studies and Afro-African studies for the past 60 years or thereabout. He's still alive. So, and his recent book, which is written in Arabic anyway, gives some idea about how the African history and African intellectual bequest can actually be brought within the larger context. So, but specifically, the idea of globalization has to do with what we call the digital turn now. All over the whole world now, you used to have what we call the rhetorical turn. Now we have the digital turn with a digitization of manuscripts and archival materials and things like that. And the idea, of course, from Ronald Robertson, which defines it as the coexistence of both universalizing and particularizing tendencies in a given system. That is to say that how do the works by Africans at home relate to their personal experiences about their home base, so to say, and how that is also related to the larger international arena. So what are the connections and what are the peculiarities that are of universal application? And so the other thing is to show that, of course, the conventional or the popular view is that Africa was basically an oral society, but of course this is no more fashionable any longer. We discovered that there were actually, in fact, literacies, not even literacy. And if you start with the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Ethiopian Yees and Baba Finag, and even in Sibyl, several other writing systems. So it would be wrong to state that only literacy in the Latin script should be considered as literacy. And of course now, just about 2 weeks ago, there was an exhibition at the British Library. Over 40 different forms of script from all over the world, including Africa, were identified, and you'll be surprised at the kind of thing. So if you look at the British Library website of the exhibition, History of Writing, we are able to see that some of the materials that were historical from Africa themselves are now getting to the global something through the digitization process. So, and that is an area that I've tried to work on. Then again, we've always had this, what I've called the tradition of denial. Now, I came to come across what was considered to be the first published African poetry in the United States by Whitley. And Whitley's poetry, which of course was in English anyway, but it shows that Phyllis Whitley, who died in 1784, and the attitude, Jefferson, the president, who happened to be the president of the United States at a point in time, was quite revealing to show that, Africans, or the blacks, according to him then, were not to be taken serious in terms of the fact that their production would not be reasonable enough to be considered as anything worthy of study. But of course, this kind of attitude also came across, we came across it in the writings of the early Europeans. In this connection, when Maurice de la Fosse was a French anthropologist, came across some Fulani or Fulbe manuscript, and which were, of course, written in Arabic. He was so dismissive to say that you could consider this kind of thing as literature, and it's not worthy of any criticism at all, because the script or the language, there's no correspondence between the Fulbe language and Arabic itself. So it wasn't to be considered at all. But again, things have since changed. And just about 2 weeks ago, Falun Gong was able to produce about 18,000 materials from Casamance alone, which were digitized and now on this Endangered Archives program of British Library, 18,000. And one of those things that fascinated me, which he was able to present some 2 years ago, was about the story about World War a particular family from Senegal who took part in the World War has a qasida in which Hitler was subject of curses and a lot of, curses, so to say. So, and the aspect that first interested was that aspect of the war that were not even documented elsewhere. Here is a report by somebody who was actually involved in the system. So this is also a new source of knowledge that we could exploit and explore, and to rewrite the authentic history of events in which Africans were not only participants, but also observers as well. So, and this is kind of what I've thought, okay, this is have a local flavor or a local input into an international pool of knowledge, which is now gaining some fashion all over the whole world. And I think we can also key into this one in other cultures as well. So I've come across some Nigerian Ajami poetry as well, or poems as well, by various traditions, from Ilorin, from Ibadan, and several other places, that are now being used for teaching, for example, short stories, prison records, correspondence, and things, or even advertisement of local products, conflicts, several other things, and also for what I call political pamphleteering. You know that it is discovered that largely in some part of Nigeria, literacy in the Arabic script was only that was popular among them. And that is why if you look at the Nigerian currency today, or the emblem of the Nigerian army, what you will see there is the word written in Arabic, but of course it is not Arabic as such, but it is the local language, but using the Arabic character. So, and this one is also meant not only for the local audience, but of course for the international audience. So how do we now have the materials generated at home now being used for the international market and knowledge and transmission of knowledge, so to say? And so that's one thing I'm trying to look at. Then again, there is this issue in some, there was, you probably know these two authors, Jean Boyd and Bavel Mark. Now, in a recent book by both of them, and I want to quote now, that there were no records or minutes of events at Sokoto Caliphate courts between 1804 and 1860, and that is not true at all. The Caliphate courts actually had records in the sense that Sharia was the system of adjudication anyway, and Arabic language had been the language of writing and whatever. So there was no way there could have been court judgment or fatwa or things like that, which would not be recorded. So some of these inaccurate reportings as well will are also been sort of re-examined to show from the records of some of these courts that they are actually court records. The fact that the person looking at the materials could not understand Arabic does not mean that there were no records at all. So there were records. So the question, there was no dark continent as such. Africa was never a dark continent, and I think there was one particular publication I see from Northwestern University by one Blackwell, saying that for thousands of years, for hundreds of years, when Europe was still in the darkness, African authors had been producing a lot of works. And of course, this tallies with what we have seen in some other publications. Paulo Farias was able to identify some inscriptions or epigraphs and things on cenotaphs and mausolea in Mali, dating back to the 11th century. So this idea of literacy not being known to Africa is not to be discussed any seriously any longer, because they have been proved, all these assumptions have been proven not to be correct. Now, what is particularly of interest to me again is that the literacy traditions in Africa, so to say, so it's not only a single tradition that we are talking about, but traditions of various forms, any form of ideographic symbolism, which conveys some ideas, whether drawings, whether paintings or whatever, things that are coming on now, not only for local consumption, but of course for the international. So, and I think there should be a spirited attempt to use all these materials as objects and sources of knowledge. They are not just objects to be studied, but what kind of information can we actually extract from them to either create new knowledge or to reinterpret existing knowledge. And that is one area I've been looking at. But of course, we know that, yes, I'm rounding up. Yes, the thing I want to use this platform to request for is that if there is a way to encourage our universities, particularly our graduate students, to take interest in these local sources, it's not just good to have those materials reactivated or preserved, but again, we should be able to use them to find out what additional information are they providing for local history, what additional information are they providing for translocal and, of course, international relationships. And I think this will be very, very important when we are writing the history of the slave trade or connections all over the whole world, within Africa and, of course, the global world. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sanni, also for coming in right on time. Our next speaker is Sheikh Abdoulaye Niang from Université Cheikh Anta Diop in Senegal. His paper title is Beyond Senegal, the Socio-Political Perspectives of a Globalized Muslim Community.
First of all, I would like to say how pleased I am to be here with you to present a paper at this conference entitled Globalization in the Muslim Worlds. I would like to thank in particular Professor Usman Khan for his outstanding ability to stimulate research dynamics and create networks researchers. Professor Khan has been instrumental in our research career. That is why I would like to pay him a heartful tribute before going any further. The paper I'm presenting today is the result of a research I have been conducting for several years, in which led to a doctoral thesis defending at the University of Toulouse-Jean-Jaurès in France. In fact, it is a question of an analysis of the globalization process of Faida Tijaniya in the light of the new ethics of presidency that underlines the strategy and project developed by supporters of the religious community. Faida's actors, mainly the heir of Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, have displayed an ability to harness the world's resources and vulnerabilities to fit the normatives specific to the original socio-cultural universe, thus laying the foundation of an experience that leads to several social, political, cultural, and economical perspectives. Born in the village of Kosi in 1929, following a self-proclamation by Sheikh Ibrahim, son of Sheikh Abdoulaye Niasse, the Faida movement has all the characteristics of transnational religious community. This branch of the Tijaniya has developed networks of allegiance in Africa and outside Africa. Wherever he is exported, it develops a social fabric supported by alliance and patronage strategies, while expanding its network of representation and intermediaries. Faida built the loyalty of its devotees thanks to Tarbiyah training, an initiation whose secret is jealously guarded by the community leaders. In the late 1930s, Sheikh Ibrahim embarked on an international dynamic and developed a logic of transnationalization to the point of becoming instrumental to the globalization of Tijaniya. By the early 1960s, Sheikh Ibrahim had already made many trips, met with prominent personalities, and succeeded in building a personal network in sub-Saharan Africa, especially in the most prominent spaces and fora in the Arab Muslim world. Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse's international success is also related to the rise of religious movements from the Muslim world, such as the Ahmadiyya movement, the Jamaat Tabligh, the Jamaati Islamiyya, the Aga Khan movement, the Muslim Brotherhood movement, and the Al-Azhar Ulema, among others. When he died in 1975, Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse bequeathed to his community a solid and dynamic religious institution, but above all, a transnational religious system on which his successor could rely to spread the influence of Faida, both in Senegal and the world. Faida members have the ambition to spread Islam through the preaching, teaching, and practice based on the Tijaniya Brotherhood. They are part of a line of itinerant missionary dedicated to the spread of Islam through the Tijaniya path. The descendant of Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse inherited a religious culture, a socialization, and a confirmation that placed them in a privileged position in terms of da'wah, call for Islam. In this religious culture, the presumption of an inherited baraka occupies an important place in that it intervenes in the reproduction of a building power whose pastoral resonance implies various consequences. Pastoral power, the guiding power at stake in the fight, determine the relationship between the heirs of Sheikh Ibrahim and the rest of the followers, and even allow the former to find a rampart in order to neutralize any desire for competition or secession to may appear in the ranks of the community. Moreover, since the death of Sheikh Ibrahim, many figures have emerged and occupied the internal space of the transnational preaching that Sheikh Ibrahim has instituted. The rise of this hair reflects both a renewal movement and the transition from a missionary process. Imam Hassan Cissé, Baba Lamine Niasse, Sheikh Mahmoud Niasse, Mariam Niasse, Rokhaya Niasse, and Umu Khairi, known as Mama Chota, Fatiha Abubakar Hashimi are some emblematic examples of this transnational renewal underway in Sheikh Ibrahim's movement. Imam Hassan established Faida in North America. This openness to the North American seems decisive insofar that it encouraged the capitalization of circulatory flows from educational and spiritual purposes. This American connection dramatically introduced a stream of ideas, supports, processes, and objects that connect Kaolack to various American cities. In addition, Cissé knew how to harness the African desire that prevailed in African American cycles to carry out a functional recording of the brotherhood work by providing convert American with a formula for spiritual integration that allows them to reconnect with their African roots. Conversely, Cissé himself takes advantage of the code and techniques from various North American sociocultural universities. In this way, he is able to combine the local space of the brotherhood community, the space of the country of settlement, and that of a globalized culture in its most accomplished dimension, the American one. Without completely emancipating himself from the existing institutional framework, Cissé was able to create his own space of personal authority based on a high business acumen, relational intelligence, a knowledge-based relationship, and a charitable policy, a technology of self probably inspired by the American management and personal development concepts. What are therefore witnessing? A process of hybridization in which the traditional mechanism of the brotherhood intersect the processes resulting from a global culture. From the 1990s, labor migration in Western Europe and the United Kingdom reached a considerable peak. For example, many Senegalese, Gambians, Ghanaians, Nigerians, citizens of countries where FIDA had members, embarked on migratory adventure. The migratory turnover expanded the scope of the preaching work had representative of FIDA, began to travel through Europe to spread the FIDA and or to strengthen the faith of the movement's follower in Europe. Mohamedou Lamine Niasse, known as Baba Lamine, is well placed in the list of transnational actors of FIDA. A career diplomat, Baba Lamine held the position of Vice-Consul of Senegal in Saudi Arabia for several years. During his career, he combined his work as a diplomat with that of a spiritual leader and promoter of FIDA in Jeddah and Riyadh. He has trained and initiated many migrant workers, including those from Southeast Asia. Until the end of his diplomatic mission in 1999, he was able to convert Sudanese, Chadian, Senegalese, Ghanaian, Nigerian, Indonesian, Bangladeshi, Indian, and others in search of spirituality or simply looking for a refugee. Transporting the brotherhood to Saudi Arabia, he transposed its ritual and manifestation, tapping into the material, relational, and symbolic resources of his stronghold of Islamic globalization, that is Jeddah. For Baba Lamin, Hassan Sise, and other members of this brotherhood, the mastery of several language tools, English, French, literary Arabic, dialectal Arabic, Hausa, Wolof, Mauritanian, German, Yoruba, etc., and subsequently the ability to gain access to several culture worlds are considerable assets. Not only that this allowed them to expand their individual resources, but it also increased their chances of reaching broader targets. Just like men, women are also involved in this globalization enterprise. Three of them had played a pioneering role. They are Mariam Nyas, Rokhayatu Nyas, and Umu Khairi Nyas, known as Mama Chota, daughters of Sheikh Ibrahim Nyas. These three female figures have initiated a path of feminization of the Brotherhood mission, which is now followed by other women from the same community. All three have set up educational institutions attended by domestic and international students. Daughter of Umu Khairi Nyas, Fatiha is fully involved in the promotion of the Faida in Africa. By presenting herself as a Muslim and modern woman, this 40-year-old lady promotes within the community new ideas in terms of rejuvenation, feminization, and the introduction of aesthetic process based on a choice of clothing, a technology of self, and a style of public presentation inspired by the globalized female Islam, which is emerging from Cairo to the various capitals of the Gulf countries, including Turkey and South Asia. These standard bearers of Faida now travel from one continent to the other. They take advantage of modern channels and new communication technologies. It is precisely by borrowing technical or organizational processes from various contemporary religious or secular movements that they are able to discover new sources of influence and thus spread with it the teaching of Faida. Forging links with actors belonging to their religious milieu and those who do not belong to their communities, they capitalize on relationship and achievement in behalf of the brotherhood. The most authoritative proponents of Faida concur in their observation of an uncertain world. This observation is all the more obvious and imposing that Faida is spreading all over the world as the proponents travel around the world. In crossing borders, Faida cross broken destinies and become a witness to the misery of the world, a world in crisis, and therefore a world to be saved. It is a matter of saving not only the hurt and the intention, but also with concrete action in terms of assistance and presence. A brotherhood that travel and encounter the most desperate situation can't help initiating action that could eradicate or alleviate people's distress. It is not just a question of developing a specifically brotherhood interpretation of the world's ill, but much more of diligent action in the face of the many emergencies, an action that bears the imprint of the brotherhood itself. To be able to take effective action against incapacity growth and spread everywhere is a moral commitment that is inherent to any presidential logic. For Faida's actor, to put humanitarian interventionism into practice is to act on social universe where poverty, material, and symbolic deprivation prevail at the same time. In other words, it is about initiating a diligent way of acting that is based on an ethic of religious inspiration. By crossing environments that are haunted by the destruction of trust and the flexibility of living and working conditions, Faida is a land of commitment that is shared with all those institutions that involved in this vast field that could be referred to as the Islamized concern of the other. The Italian anthropologist Ernesto Di Martino rightly poses the problem of an unstable relationship between self and the world and culture form of restoration of presence. The focus on our analysis is not to be found in the mythical perspective core to this author's research. On the other hand, we'll take away the idea that a world culture invention arises from the violence and history as described by individuals. It's by becoming aware of the appalling alterity of a disintegrating world that individuals implement concrete strategies in the hope of finding their way back to their reality and definitely combating the alienating tendency of globalization. In this respect, the myriads of emerging projects leading to new social spaces create a new solidarity that testify to an existential leap forward. The resulting potential for political and cultural mobilization suggests to the actor a new adherence, a supposedly more promising revival. FIDA's actors think that there is a strategy unique to the brotherhood to exercise the fragility and the anguish of not being in the world. They therefore assign to the religious community the role of a lifeline which would make it possible to move towards a unifying horizon and the collective presence in the world. Behind all the initiatives set up on both sides, there is the issue of domesticating the world. This applied to Nasrul Ilmi in the United States as well as to Sheikh al-Islam Foundation or Nasratuddin in Niger. These entities linked to FIDA operate in different national contexts, although very active in the United States, where it's engaged in charitable and socio-educational activities. The Nasrul Ilm operate in Senegal thanks to the traveling of its members. In Kaolack, this entity born under the leadership of Imam Hassan Sise carries out action in favor for the needy. With its various branches established in the US, the entity is built through patronage and voluntarism. Its member regularly fundraise for the benefit of vulnerable groups and for social and health care. Over time, the members of this association have succeeded in gaining hearts and minds in Senegal as they inspire as a disciple of Sheikh Hassan, who have been able to set up an entity called by Assistance Médicale, by Medical Assistance, BAM, sponsoring by Imam Hassan Sise. By Assistance Médicale provide free consultation of medicine for pilgrims visiting the religious city. Periodically, the assistance operation follow a delocalization relocation logic, in that local culture forces always interfere with the recontextualization of a globalized modality of action, humanitarian action. Moreover, this mode of action is spread as a contagion effect in all the countries where FIDA has followers, with always an assumed reference to the leader of FIDA, who were pioneers in this field. This can be seen in Niger, in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, in Cameroon, in South Africa, and in Cote d'Ivoire, where a disciple of Sheikh Hassan named Omar Sharif succeeded in setting up a Sheikh Ibrahim Niass Foundation, which is in the process of carving out a place for itself on the Ivorian public scene. This ongoing transformation also owe their development to the globalization of financing circuit related to a new form of patronage in the Persian Gulf country in behalf of sub-Saharan Africa. Sheikh Mahmoud Niass, son of Sheikh Ibrahim, had many supporters and friends in Saudi Arabia and the Arab world in general. Sheikh Ibrahim's son pursued bonds of friendship that his father had weaved with some Arab princes from the ruling families. Thus, he was able to travel regularly to the Arab country, where he raises funds to support those in distress and needy. Along the line, he created several entities, including COMAF, Comité d'Organisation des Manifestations de la FREDA, and the political party RP, Rassemblement du Peuple, People's Rally. In the eyes of his spokesperson, the RP was founded on a community-based vision of FIDA. This implied that this political entity intends to work on community-based platform for the sake of others. The president of the party is himself referred to as the first servant. This constant concern of others, which represent a certain way of caring about the world, is reflected in concrete actions that range from the distribution of sheep and food to religious events, Eid al-Kabir, Maulid, to the distribution of scholarship, the organization of competition, to the massive financing of pilgrimage journey for people whose means would not have allowed them to honor this pillar of Islam. The ethic of presidency, it seems, is the real thread of all the initiative and processes developed by FIDA's actors. It is on the basis of this commitment to act in the world that they hope to defy the time of the crisis, that of the socio-economic and culture changes inherent in political, economic, and financial globalization. To demonstrate a presence in the world is not only to try to inhabit it, but also to ensure that living in the world is backed on cultural values that have reintegration function. It is a question of tapping into the reserve of community to lay the foundation for a new presence in a world threatened by market forces, including capitalistic, technologic, and virtual forces. The religious community, like many others, intends to intervene to ward off chaos and promise, at least to its supporter, a better order. This ambition of presence intersects with that of a family, the Nyas family at the heart of FIDA, and which claim a long tradition of generosity, hospitality, and benevolency. Thus, the presence is geared towards safeguarding a social memory and preserving a family honor. Tradition then serves as a leverage in an intentional perspective of reparation. The initiative flourishing in the rank of FIDA are in line with this new political model more directly rooted in civil society and transcend national borders. This model embodied symbolically by transnational NGO, position private actor, association network in space, once occupied by public institutional, increasingly subject to a policy of disengagement and privatization. Religious networks are now addressing societal issues once devolved to public institutions, and this has turned it out to be a strategy of visibility and proximity to the general population. Thus, investment and engagement with the weak and vulnerable become an advertising framework from religious organizations, in particular transnational ones. The language of salvation, both social and economic salvation, adopted by this transnational religious group, is shaped by the philosophical and religious repositories that are intended to provide the signals of future security, prosperity, and coherency, micropolitical strategy to conquer meaning and humanity, and offer hope and recovery. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Niang. Our next speaker is Youssef Carter, who is here at Harvard University. Do you have any visual? Okay, I'll give you 5 minutes.
Okay. Good afternoon. So firstly, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this important conversation. I see some old faces in the room, so hello, and I see some new friends. So also, I need to apologize for being late, and I also need to apologize for maybe having to run a little bit early. The way my day worked out, I have another panel, a religion panel in my Department of Anthropology that I need to be a part of at 3:30. Somehow, we'll make it work. Anyway, so the title of my paper is Tarbiyah as Liberation from Senegal to the American South. And so, what is liberation? What does it really mean to be free, and what are the limits of freedom? What I mean to ask through this simple line of inquiry, for those of us who aren't quite sure how to answer this question, not sure I do, is whether our conceptions of freedom are strictly reliant upon our relationships within and or to the institutions or structures that seem to cage us. Popular modes of freedom seeking, i.e. sort of political activism, seem to rest on an assumption that disrupting oppressive systems should produce some kind of lasting progress in which the residues of infrahumanity, that is the concept of race, I guess you could say, are similarly, or at least gradually, sort of addressed after those oppressive systems are undone. But this might not be true. It could be that attacking structures of colonial domination and systems of oppression do not necessarily address the internalization of symbolic violence. If, for example, racist thought structures how we see each other and ourselves, how would the undoing of institutional racism address how those thought structures have inhabited us? After all, Ishil Mbembe, in his Critique of Black Reason, tells us that race is, quote unquote, a structure of the imagination that escapes the limitations of the concrete, of what is sensed, of the finite. Its power comes from its capacity to produce schizophrenic objects constantly, peopling and repeopling the world with substitutes, beings to point to break, in a hopeless attempt to support a failing eye. The sight of an encounter with the shadows and hidden zones of the unconscious. And so perhaps actual liberation requires a dual approach in which the material conditions of violence and dispossession are addressed, and notions of freedom are simultaneously untethered from those material conditions. For what good is the undoing of racist institutions without the proper eradication or refuge even from the categories of thought upon which they were erected and are constantly reproduced? Finally, are we forever doomed if those oppressive structures are never disrupted? And so with these questions in mind, of what significance, I ask, as a group of predominantly African and African-American Sufi Muslims who have sought inward refinement and retreat in the context of a broader political landscape that yields anti-Black racism and Islamophobia. Over the course of my own ethnographic research at a Zawiya mosque in Moncks Corner, South Carolina, and a number of research visits to Senegal, I've had an opportunity to think more deeply about these questions, about the sort of boundaries of liberation, and further how the people that I've learned from and with imagine freedom for themselves. Moreover, I come to the conclusion that Tarbiyah, right, that moral training, both necessitates and is inherently anti-racist work. And so I ask these questions in the spirit of trying to think through what kind of knowledges are transmitted in this sort of tariqa that I've studied with, the Mustafawri, that originates in Senegal and has sort of communities throughout West Africa and in the American South, right? And I'm also concerned with what political work that homegoing discourses that take place in the community enact amongst African American and African Muslims who engage themselves in the Mustafawi tradition of spiritual expansion. And so at the core of my analysis lies a preoccupation with understanding precisely the manner by which particular Muslim subjectivities are cultivated within the bounds of a specific practice of spiritual cultivation. In the American South, right, particularly in Moncks Corner, South Carolina, that cultivation takes place in a mosque that is situated on a former slave plantation, and is informed in this case, as I show, through the medium of tarbiyah, right, moral training, of which the religious poetry of the founding Sheikh Muhammad Mustafa Gai Haidar, is a part. And so the call to actualize a return to the fitra, that is this sort of primordial human state, inclined toward God consciousness and cleansed of negative or harmful experiences, via tasqiyah, right? The sort of eradication of the lower, sort of disfigured human self that it's race-inflected. And so remembrance of Allah, for example, involves and is contingent upon an intimate awareness or discovery of one's higher self that is achieved through attending to the body and spirit. And so students connect themselves to these West African Sufi practices because the processes of tarbiyah and tazkiyah allows them to address traumas produced through an enduring bodily and historical violence. And so through an emphasis on inward mastery and bodily discipline through charity and service, or khidmah, right, they also practice an alternative approach to psycho-spiritual care. And so my analysis extends, therefore, beyond studies of Muslim ethical cultivation via embodiment in Muslim majority contexts, right, by examining how ethical cultivation operates as a work of self-healing in the context of racial violence and oppression. At the same time, however, students witness the direct forms of care dispensed and practiced by their teacher as he attends to the material and practical needs of community members and visitors. And modeling care in a communal capacity is thus a vital and vigorous component of moral training. And so essentially, the Mustafawi Tariqa is a transatlantic Sufi order that originates in Thiès, in Senegal, in 1966 by way of Sheikh Mustafa, and establishes a presence in South Carolina in the mid-1990s, and has been there ever since via Sheikh Mustafa's protege, Sheikh Harun Fai. And so during my research, it became evident that one of the major strategies for engaging in the techniques of spiritual care was mediated through the writings or the qasidas of Sheikh Mustafa, provided through Sheikh Harun. And so outside of impromptu lectures and daily mosque activities, the community regularly gathered on a weekly basis to recite spiritual poetry conceived of community conceived decades ago, By reciting the poetry, the Monk's Corner community sends praises and salutations upon the Prophet Muhammad and use a formulaic approach to utter a comprehensive supplication for health, protection, wealth, and continued spiritual growth. And so through elevating Muhammad, for example, who is believed to be a complete and perfected human being, the supplicants hope to elevate themselves. The most popular poem that was written by Sheikh Mustafa and that is transmitted throughout the community is comprised of 288 verses and is entitled Al-Bahru Muhit, right, the vast ocean. And it's alternatively titled, Leave Me with My Love of the Prophet. And it begins by praising attributes of the Prophet. And so the entire poetic framing of the Bahru Muhit hinges upon a following refrain, which is repeatedly sung in concert before every verse. Ahmaduna, Mahmaduna, Nabiyuna, Tabibuna, Mugituna, Shafi'una, Shamsul Huda, Fil Alami. Right? Our Ahmad, our Mahmud, our prophet and our doctor, our helper and our intercessor, the son of guidance in the realm of the universe. The lyrics of this celebratory ode provide a specific language that allows the supplicant performers to pray for protection from external harms and internal shortcomings. In addition to praying for physical healing, the verses seem to request alleviation from oppressive forces described as enemies, right? In addition to the Bahr Muhit, Sheikh Mustafa also composed another qasida that's performed in the community and throughout the network. It's entitled The Cloak of Protection and Soldiers of Divine Care. And it differs from the former insofar as it more directly provides the fuqara, or the sort of Muslims in Monk's Corner, South Carolina, as well as Senegal and throughout the network, with a supplication for protection. And in this sense, protection from the lower self and the repelling of enemies are the central focus of this ode, as Monk's Corner Muslims, in particular, rely on it to ensure their bodily security as well. And so just to sort of read a few lines in English. And I will never fear my enemies, as you are my protection from all of creation. With the cutting sword of your name on my breath, I am protected from every type of enemy. Repel evil and treachery from me by your great soldiers of divine care. Repel anyone who wants to harm my physical body by your sword, which is broad in its scope. Oh, you who can work paper with your knowledge, put into action at the French Mint. And we'll talk about that in a second. And so at the time of composing this ode in the late 1960s, Senegal was a land that had recently achieved its independence from colonization, right, in 1959, and was still grappling with the impact of French policies that favored secular modernization, while it imposed a Eurocentric approach to disembodied education upon West African Muslims. Sheikh Mustafa's religious poetry was meant to combat this trend by inscribing spiritual efficacy into the hearts and onto the bodies of those he led. And so performance of the Bahr Muhit and other qasidas, therefore in that context sort of simultaneously an act of Islamic piety and resistance to colonial shifts toward racial difference and secularization. In spite of Senegal's fairly recent independence at that time period, and so taking the notion of a collective bodily habitus further and extending it into the context of a present-day American South with a legacy of political and economic repression of Black folks is pronounced. African-American Muslims collectively find solace and healing in Sheikh Mustafa's qasidas. And so we should consider that the Mustafawi poetry was written with the intent of providing a regimen for future students, not yet present and unknown in the time of their composition. Thus, supplication for intimate knowledge, irfan, and protection would apply to recently decolonized and present-day Senegal, as well as the contemporary American South. My own experience with participating in the zikr circles, reciting the qasaid of Sheikh Mustafa, while living at the Zawiya of Monk's Corner, and during time spent in Senegal afforded me the opportunity to view these performances as part of a broader technique of care and healing. And so zikr, therefore, has provided this community with a strategy of self-care and healing that has the potential to undo both the pronounced and subtle effects of psychic and historical trauma. And so the collective performances of these odes and the broader ethical engagements via tasawwuf reveals an utter investment on the part of African-descended Muslims in the unseen, a variant understanding of power and the real. Rather than place emphasis on undoing materialities of racial subjectivity alone and the extant institutions that disempower only, these Muslims rely on the all-powerful to change or improve their condition while also participating in forms of communal care. And so I'm attempting to sort of think through West African Sufi ethics as a philosophy of freedom. One of the other things that I took note of and examined during my ethnographic research was the way in which West African and African American Muslims alike in South Carolina and in Senegal sort of take on this life of the murid, right? And so I'm trying to think through the manner in which varying kinds of labor and khidma or service are deployed, right? And so on one hand, you have the manner in which itinerant labor is relied upon in this sort of blue-collar space where sort of industry is very blue-collar and jobs are hard to find. And so a lot of the men in particular engage in contractual labor via the electrical trade. And so people leave and come, leaving and going all the ways, right? This increases mobility and allows one to seek sort of economic prominence outside of the community where jobs are hard to find, but at the same time are able to sort of leave those contractual jobs at the drop of a hat to participate in the community programming. And then the other thing, having to do with khidma and community service, right, and communal care, there's a manner in which I'm sort of trying to think through charitable giving that takes place in the community as a kind of activism, right? So for example, one of the things that happens is the Zawiya is opened up for people who are sort of recently released from prison, right? Muslims who sort of either were Muslim before or came to Islam during their incarceration. The space is opened up for people to have a place to go. So it serves pretty much as a halfway house at certain times. There's also the cooking and sharing of food, right, which is its own sort of form of communal care, but also serving the Cheikh, right, the khidma, right? One gentleman whose name was Omar, who was a Gambian Muslim student, is particularly relocated from, partially relocated from Maryland to South Carolina in order to serve as a personal chauffeur and assistant to Sheikh Harun, right? So practically speaking, Omar lives as a true murid by spending every waking moment in service of his teacher. Surely he believes that his sins are removed with every bead of sweat he wipes from his brow while devoting his energy to service. Admittedly, I'm sort of again, still thinking through the manner in which willful forms of service and servitude are deployed as a means of tarbiyah, as a means of emancipatory ethics, right? Particularly in that space, a mosque full of Black African Muslims located on a former slave plantation, right? And situated within a broader Atlantic historical memory. But thus far, I reflect on how Rudolf Ware's historical analysis of Quran schooling in West Africa and his framing of purposeful disciplining, right, as a kind of route toward embodied knowing, provides a path for better understanding the spiritual motives and strategies for labor as potential liberation in my own research context. And so, in analyzing West African Sufi modes as care and as a sort of philosophy of freedom, a natural question we might ask is, what is it in particular about West African Sufism that provides a specific liberatory potential for Muslims of African descent, right? Say apart from other Sufi traditions, right? And so every year, Sheikh Harun leads a group of his African-American students to African and African-American students to Senegal to participate in an annual event called Sheikh Mustafa Day, to commemorate his own teacher by celebrating his memory, meeting his family members, former students, and visiting his tomb. And so during the trip, he encourages his American students in particular to visit Gorée Island, to visit the Maison d'Esclaves, so the House of Slaves, and other historic sites in and around Dakar in particular. If time allows, he also makes a point to take them to see the holy city of Touba, with its impressive Grand Mosque. Thus, their ziyara, the spiritual tourism, is combined with heritage tourism. And by doing this, Sheikh Harun hopes to inspire within his students a healthy love of Africanness that is rooted in Islamic culture. That their Blackness, African heritage, and Muslim identities can be simultaneously welcomed and positively recognized. And so throughout the trip, African-American visitors, for example, are fed, housed, and cared by their African colleagues, and theoretically get to experience a kind of all-encompassing welcome that they likely do not have access to in their everyday lives. What I highlight here is the manner in which such trips are filled with imbricating religious and cultural meanings that concurrently reveal a politics and an ethics at work, that of hijrah, of refuge, right? That African-American Muslims and West African Muslims seeking refuge, since there were Muslims in this country, right, is not a new phenomenon. They have continually carved space for themselves in order to produce conditions of safety and security disallowed in mainstream North American space. And so Robert Dannon, all right, let's do it, Robert Dannon has made sense of this as he discusses this historical trend. He talks about hijra as a globalizing force, right, for organizing cultural meaning and among the corpus of sort of believers. Yeah, I'm going to talk to y'all later, so I'm going to just jump to the conclusion. So, quite similar to the prophetic hadith that to know oneself is to know one's Lord, it is no secret that one of the sort of lasting philosophical interventions that was popularized via the Islamically inflected Black popular musical tradition, otherwise known as hip-hop, particularly during its golden age, is the notion of knowledge of self, right? Put shortly, the principle of knowledge of self requires that one take critical inventory of the natural self, or the original self, fitra, right? Because of the beginning of knowledge is knowledge of self. And so in examining the local and transatlantic journeys that African and African-American Mustafawi Muslims take in order to learn directly from their spiritual guide, Sheikh Harun Afai, and to pay homage to Sheikh Muhammad Mustafa Gai Haidar, I have more meaningfully, I feel, understood the significance of religious performance in the quest to renew or reconfigure the Black African Muslim self. And so participating in Sheikh Mustafa Day, for example, on the part of these Muslims, right, affirms the Senegalese cultural and religious heritage through which they pay homage to their teacher and his teacher. Movement of the body is not a requisite for a movement of the soul, but it helps. Insofar as the imaginal homeland for African-American Muslims is placed in sub-Saharan Africa, travel to Senegal becomes simultaneously an act of spiritual migration and cultural tourism. And if initiation and inclusion into the sort of tribe of the Middle Passage, as Saidiya Hartman calls it, might be considered a state of being which is ongoing, then feeling at home in a land made strange by the violence of forced migration takes time. Like the expansion and contraction of diaspora communities, Tazkiyah is processual insofar as the maintenance of religious identities requires vigilance and consistent performance. Tarbiyah, likewise, necessitates constant observance. And so the reconfiguring of the self means constant work. And so further, I argue that the deployment and instrumentalization, of a West African Sufi ethics, what we can call a decolonial archive, in order to reconfigure an essential self is a critique of Black reason. That is, through a reclaiming of African heritage, right, via diasporic practices of remembrance, the recitation of spiritual poetry, the dispensation of labor and community service, and the performance of homegoing, right, repatriation discourses. Muslims in Monk's Corner and beyond can live out a disavowal of racial economic subjectivity, produced through oppositional practices and discourses that otherwise contribute to various forms of domination. In this way, this particular route to liberation via Tarbiyah, practices of bodily discipline and training to procure an embodied knowing, provides a decolonization of spirit, tazkiyat al-nafs. Adherence to this philosophy of freedom, tasawwuf, is to simultaneously inhabit humanist and insurgent Black African identities, not informed by race, but rather by humanization, right, for example. And it operates as an extension of a moral imagination that is theological in nature. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, panelists. 3 very rich papers, lots of food for questions. So we'll open it up to questions now. Please wait for the microphone to come to you before you ask your question. Who wants to go first? Over here?
Thank you all for 3 great, very thought-provoking papers. I had a question for Professor Sanni. I like the way that you framed everything here, talking about the exposure of really not new materials, but drawing attention to materials in Africa that have been there for quite some time. But as Professor Khan's work on non-Europhone intellectuals has shown, there's been a huge and rigid division, specifically in the academy, with respect to the languages in which sources have been produced and then the language in which scholarship has been carried out. And I was wondering if you've identified any ways beyond simply just the digitization of sources and then putting them online, that we've been able to advance a little bit beyond that and break down the barriers specifically between the Europhone and Arabophone worlds. Thank you.
Go ahead.
You want me to?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I thought, okay. Yeah, I think the issue of digitization is just a recent development. As Riley said, that codestria work on Europhone or whatever, I think there's not been good working relationship, so to say, between French-based and English-based scholars on Africa as such at the moment, in terms of the manuscript studies, for example. And I think there are also equally very good studies in German. But because of language barrier, many people have not been able to access that as well. So there's need for an integrated approach to all these things. And I think, I wouldn't know how that platform will come, but I think it's quite necessary so that we won't be working at cross purposes. But I think because the major problem we have in many of the manuscript repositories in West Africa, let me put it that way, is preservation and the unwillingness of many of the families that have them to make them available. Interestingly, you see, even within families, you could have a single work, and every member of a family thinks there's a baraka there. So you can have a book on history, for example, everyone wants to take a share of that because they believe that. So there's that kind of problem. So that is why if you're able to have a central repository where all these things could be, of course, you can decide to share to grandchildren or whatever. People can have access to the original something. And I think there's a need for an integrated something to ensure that is done between Francophone and Anglophone researchers.
Other questions? Yes. She's coming with the microphone.
Professor Carter, I remember you talking about, I believe, certain rituals such as homecoming, and comparing what goes on here in this country with in Senegal, I think, with that particular Sheikh, or who brings people from here there. So I was thinking of the highly ritualized homecoming in New Orleans, and New Orleans is known for its roots in Senegal, and I wondered if you knew of something similar in Senegal in terms of the actual homecoming exercise.
I'm not sure I entirely grasp all of your questions, but
Okay.
so are you asking for me to sort of flesh out what the sort of nature of like homecoming discourses or homegoing discourses as they emerge in Monk's Corner and in Senegal, or?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So first of all, I apologize for the sort of rapid fire, all that stuff I just threw at you, sorry. But one of the things that I wanted to communicate through the paper is the manner in which Monk's Corner, South Carolina acts as its own sort of configuration of home, right, and refuge, as well as Senegal, particularly for sort of the West African and African American students that are part of this tariqa, that are part of this sort of Atlantic, global spiritual network. And so there's a manner in which sort of local as well as transatlantic circulation or migration occurs. And so just practically speaking, you have students that are situated throughout the sort of eastern United States who travel for Eid celebrations or whenever a Sheikh decides that there needs to be some sort of community meeting where matters need to be discussed that are sort of that concern the community, that people are sort of called to visit from sort of Philadelphia, Washington, North Carolina, up from Atlanta, et cetera. But on an annual case or basis, he takes students with him from South Carolina to Senegal to participate in what's called Sheikh Mustafa Day in the tariqa. And so I find it interesting that he encourages students in particular who have not been to Senegal, African-American students who have not been to Senegal, to, in the wake of sort of visiting the tomb of Sheikh Mustafa and meeting the family members in Chest, to, at the same time, during the trip, visit Gorée Island, so that this sort of door of no return becomes a door of return, for all intents and purposes. And so the sort of questions of repatriation and homegoing discourses, I'm sort of trying to sort of think through what meanings culturally and politically that they carry. At the same time, there are people that want to go, but they can't go for whatever reason, be it economic or what have you. But they still engage in those sort of homegoing discourses. And so trying to sort of find meaning in that as well. Because there's a manner in which, and then at the same time, people who are part of the Tariqa in Senegal who want to visit Monk's Corner because they hear so much about it back in Chess and in Dakar, who want to make it over to visit the Monk's Corner community but can't for whatever reason.
I was asking a very specific question.
Okay.
You know, the homecoming ceremony in New Orleans is very, the homecoming, the funeral services in New Orleans are very celebrated. It's a very distinct
So I
way.
think you're asking, you're using the term homecoming to refer to burial practices.
Right.
Yeah, I'm
Well,
not talking about
not burial as much as the whole
like
ritual.
like a funeral dirge, right?
Right. And I just wondered, has there been any intellectual discourse or scholarship comparing like what goes on here with what goes on there?
Yeah. So
part of that the trip to the tomb, have people observed and maybe compared what
Yeah,
has
so
happened
I'm
in
not
New
familiar
Orleans?
with any of that, and particularly in the New Orleans example that you raised. So unfortunately, sorry.
Thank you all for your papers. I actually have two questions. One to Professor Cheikh Niang. I was really taken by your articulation of new spatialities and new solidarities, and I was wondering if you could speak more about new conceptions of spatiality, and are you thinking of that beyond, is transnationalization the way that you're thinking about that, or I just wondered if you could flesh that out a little bit more. And for Dr. Carter, I was really taken by your very provocative questions to kind of start off of, what do we mean by liberation, and is it conditioned by particular kind of structures and forms of oppression? And as you're kind of laying out this idea of like labor and liberation and practices of self-care, I'm curious about a sense of shared oppression in terms of racism for like African American Muslims that are going, like what is shared maybe in terms of a conception of anti-Blackness or what Blackness means for non-African American Muslims that are also in Senegal.
So what I say is that the transnationalization process bring a new change in the fighters' orientation and give them many opportunities to be to have visibility in the public sphere, public scene, even in Senegal and in the other countries. And politicians, Senegalese politicians, if they see the new position of this brotherhood of the fighter, they come to research connection with fighter actors so as to get the positional in the electoral position, and this electoral position transform radically the game, the political game in Senegal. But even if women, men, and the young people, they invest in social networks, and they use image of fighters actors traveling from Senegal to Nigeria, to America, to Indonesia, to Saudi Arabia. And this is something really crucial in the orientation of the fighter. That's why I said it's a new ethic of presidency. Through this orientation, this transnationalization, they define a new perspective of presidency, even in political time, in economic times, and in philosophical time.
Yes, hi. Thank you for your question. So in terms of thinking about shared notions of Blackness, there's a certain way in which in the context of the American South, particularly in Moncks Corner, South Carolina. So number one, Moncks Corner, South Carolina is not a place you just up and decide to move to, right? Who's heard of Moncks Corner, South Carolina? Exactly. You have. Yeah, well, yeah. You didn't. So outside of hearing about my work, I guess. But it is a place that doesn't offer a lot of things to do, right? But you have these students that have moved, that decided to leave their sort of fancy, attractive jobs and lives in northern urban centers or from the South and decided to sort of move to this small space where the only thing to do is hang out at the mosque or go to Charleston and do things there. But the reason I bring that up is because there are a number of West African students who have done this, who have found this place and utilized this space as a space of refuge. The question is why? What are they seeking refuge from, right? In my discussions with the students in that space, be they sort of West African or African American, in interesting ways, the sort of questions of the politics of blackness and black Muslimness come up, right? And there's a manner in which so for example, one of the incidents that happened during my ethnographic research was the 2015 shooting at Charleston, in Charleston, right, where 9 church members were killed, right, racially motivated murder. That sort of had sort of a direct and indirect impact on the community, particularly as sort of broader discussions about police brutality, varying forms of sort of racialization, symbolic and bodily violence were points of discussion in and around the mosque. And so, yeah, there's a specific way in which people are sort of thinking of themselves, right, and rethinking of themselves. In my work, I'm trying to sort of think about what is the nafs, right? And as one sort of attempts to sort of address the nafs, like this sort of notion of a lower self, often in sort of theological spaces, the nafs are discussed in terms of spiritual terms. But the sort of political resonances and residues of violence that can imprint the self aren't discussed or aren't considered in terms of thinking about the nafs. And so thus, the skillful nafs refers, in my mind, in terms of how I'm sort of trying to frame this, is not just a matter of addressing questions of inclinations to anger or inclinations to greed or these things, but also having to do with the work of cleansing oneself of varying forms of trauma, right? Historical trauma, histories of violence, right? Present day violence. And so the work that's being done is not just a matter of deracialization, but rather of rehumanization. Because if we think about scholars like Sylvia Winter, who argues that essentially that our understanding of the human being is one that's not quite what we think it is, right? Man versus the human, right? Do we actually have a healthy conception of the human being, right? If racist thought is an all-pervading, all-encompassing, producing and reproducing thing that structures how we see others and how we see ourselves, right? How do we then understand the human being outside of that? Can we understand the human being outside of that? And so these are questions that are being addressed through what I'm sort of thinking about as a kind of West African Sufi ethics. West African because of the particular sort of configurations and literatures and poetics that sort of come out in this particular space. I hope I answered your question.
Oh, you have them.
No, please go first. I'm not even sure what I'm asking.
Well, I don't know if I'm sure either, but
I'll try, but I'm not sure. No, you can go first.
Okay, all right. Dr. Carter, I have a question for you as well. So you mentioned a little bit about Hijra, and even when you mentioned now, like people, I know Monk's Corner, yeah, like there's not, a lot of people are migrating from like urban areas, right? Like centers of economic centers are coming to a place where there's not a lot of work and things like that. I was wondering how you think, how do they invoke hijra and hijra to this place, even thinking about, hijra to Medina and other forms of hijra to Ethiopia? Like, what is the relationship between like hijra and this particular rural area? Like, does that come up?
Yeah, the name of the mosque is, I neglected to say, is Masjidul Muhajirun wal Ansar. Yeah, kind of important. Sorry, I didn't mention that earlier. So there's something very interesting about this sort of naming of the mosque that is sort of very purposefully and intentionally sort of conceived through Sheikh Harun Fai, the sort of Senegalese spiritual expert who moves from West Africa to the United States in the mid-1990s and has been teaching and sort of providing varying forms of care and sort of training and education in that space since then. There's an interesting sort of manner in which that sort of naming or hearkening back to the sort of refugee status of this sort of nascent Muslim community that moves from Mecca to Medina and then puts down roots and can then flourish, right? That then is sort of transported and thought about in the context of this southern United States space, community primarily comprised of sort of African and West African and African American Muslims. The question is, who are the refugees and who are the assistants, or who are the sort of allies, right? And there's ways in which you can sort of think of West Africans as the sort of those that are sort of refugees, and the sort of community is the state of taking them in, and then vice versa, right? One of the sort of things that I think about is this sort of marrying of cultural sort of items. So for example, every week the community brings food and eats after Juma. Candied yams and macaroni and cheese get sort of served with chicken yassa and bisap and ginger juice, right? People are sort of, African Americans are trying their best to sort of, pretend like they know Wolof. Some are really good at it because they've gone and they've lived there in Dakar or Chess for a while and have come back. I mean, there's a lot that I sort of can't share here, but I hope to talk to some of you outside of this space. I hope I answered your question. Kind of. We'll talk. Yeah. I have to leave in 30 seconds, by the way. So, sorry.
Hi, Dr. Carter. I think I was really fascinated by your articulation of zikr. The zikr as a form of self-care and healing and liberation itself. I am wondering how we can maybe translate that into our critical pedagogy itself. The start of healing ourselves from so many years of colonization and so many years of oppressing ourselves.
Yeah.
But also you go back to the guy Omar who went to South Carolina and follow the Sheikh. I think in a sense it speaks to a contradiction. Because in the zikr and in the tariqah we seek liberation also, but at the same time we follow the Sheikh and follow everything that the Sheikh is telling to us.
Yeah, indeed.
And then I think I end up saying to you to elaborate by the beginning of knowledge is knowledge itself.
Of knowledge of self.
Of knowledge of the self, right? So where do all this, I mean, a triangular thing fit in?
Yeah. I'll try to do my best to answer that. So I'm still sort of thinking about what the varying kinds of labor means in the context of this space, right? So let's talk about zikr for a second. One of the things that I'm trying to sort of do in my work is think about what zikr means, right? In terms of remembrance, right? There's this notion of like remembering God, but also this manner in which this question of remembering the self comes up in the wake of doing that, right? So for African-American Muslims in particular who have sort of taken on a sheikh who is Senegalese, right, who is West African, there's a manner in which people sort of think about the manner in which in that space, right, hundreds of years ago, right, a good portion of the people who were enslaved, right, and forcibly migrated and enslaved in that space were Muslim. Say, for example, Omar ibn Said, who was taken from what is present-day Senegal, I believe, brought through Charleston, South Carolina, 30 minutes driving distance from Moncks Corner, and then made to work on a plantation in North Carolina. And so there's a manner in which, I mean, there's sort of a lot of sort of ethnographic stuff I can share with you about sort of students thinking about the manner in which they sort of come to this knowledge of self, right? Or sort of imagine themselves as returning to sort of the sort of spiritual practices of potential ancestors, right? And I use the term reversion in my work to think about that. And so reversion is a notion of conversion to Islam for people who were not born Muslim, but also that's sort of imprinted with notions of historical return or return to a kind of something that was lost, right? So for example, if African Americans look to sort of West African sort of Muslimness as, or African American Muslims look to sort of West Africa as a space of like, you know, a kind of tradition or place where they were extracted, right? Latino Muslims might look to, say, more Spain, for example. If you think about Harold Morales, who works on Muslims in the United States, particularly amongst the Latino population. And so there's a third thing. So this sort of notion of contradiction, right? I'm trying to think about what it means for people to willingly give themselves and serve this sheikh in particular, particularly in light of this space that is situated on Gippy Plantation or Louisville Plantation, where khutbah is being given during Jummah about the sort of virtues of being an Abdullah, right? Servant of God, a slave of God, right? Sort of map onto this notion of a kind of resistance to or consideration of a historical slave experience. Yeah, and then there's also notions of the sort of return to a sort of original self, right? A fitra, right? That is absent of the kinds of historical trauma, race-based trauma that sort of so imprints the human being as we know it. Yeah.
Just a quick one. Now, the Mustafawiya thing, the Muridiya, and the Niang, now in the diaspora, so to say, any link at all? I've never heard about this Mustafa something even in Nigeria. There.
Yeah.
So is it limited only to Senegal and here, or does it have any branches in Africa?
So there's Zawiya in South Carolina, in Cordoba in Spain, and now in Indonesia, as well as other places in West Africa. Yeah. I mean, it's a sort of it's a new tariqa, right? It's not widespread as the Tijani and the Muridiya, but also there's a lot of cross fertilization in these communities in the local context. So, for example, in North Carolina, there's a community, a Gambian Muslim Association that's sort of heavily Murid that invites the sheikh to come speak and brings singers and thank you. I have to run. I'm so sorry.
We'll liberate you from your pain.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll get to talk later. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you.